She was a little girl in a blue dress, crying on the steps of a dance school. He was a billionaire in a suit who almost walked past, until 4 words changed their lives forever. It was a cloudy Thursday in early spring when Andrew Carter walked down a quiet residential street on the outskirts of Seattle. He wasn't supposed to be there. His driver had made a wrong turn, and instead of going straight to the office for another investor meeting, Andrew asked to be dropped off a few blocks away. He said he needed some fresh air. In truth, he needed silence, the kind that asks no questions and expects no answers. He walked with his hands in the pockets of his light gray suit. His expensive shoes made a soft sound on the wet asphalt. Andrew looked exactly as the world perceived him, confident, polished, unattainable. But inside, he was just a shell of the man he once was. His wife, Lily, had died only 8 months prior after a brutal battle with cancer. Since then, Andrew had mastered the art of functioning without truly living. He filled his calendar with meetings, launched new divisions in his company, and smiled for the right cameras. But his home was silent, and his heart even emptier. He passed a modest dance studio, tucked between a laundromat and a delicatessen. It wasn't the kind of place he usually noticed. A chalk sign hung on the door reading, "Father-daughter dance today at 1 p.m." He barely paid it any mind until he saw her. She sat alone on the steps in front of the building, her arms folded on her small knees. Her fair hair was neatly tied into a bun with a bright blue ribbon. She wore a delicate sky blue dress that shimmered slightly in the dim light. Her white ballet slippers were worn, and her posture was too still for a child her age. Andrew instinctively slowed his pace. There was something about the way her eyes stared at the ground, as if he had let them down, that made him stop. He hesitated, unsure if approaching her would frighten her or cause trouble, but as he stepped closer, she looked up. Her eyes were the color of the sea before a storm, blue, clear, yet filled with heavy emotion. She didn't flinch, didn't ask who he was. Instead, in a quiet voice he could barely hear, she said, "It's a dance with my daddy, and I don't have one." Her words hit him like a fist to the chest. There was no drama in her tone, just simple truth, and that made it all the more painful. Andrew slowly crouched down, lowering himself to her level. His knees clicked, reminding him he wasn't young anymore. But in that moment, something inside him, the part that had been numb for months, shifted. He looked into her eyes, and without thinking, said, "Then I'll be your daddy for this dance." There was no dramatic music, no crowd of onlookers. Just a girl with broken hope, and a man with a broken heart, meeting in the middle of an ordinary sidewalk, changing both their lives without even realizing it. Sophie Brooks was finishing her 10th consecutive night shift at the city hospital when her phone buzzed with a message from her neighbor. It contained just a few words. "Emma had a wonderful night at the dance. She'll tell you all about it. By the way, you should ask her about the man in the gray suit." The message puzzled her, but there was no time to reply. She was already late picking up her daughter. Her body ached in ways she had long stopped trying to describe. The hospital had been chaos all night. Urgent calls, sirens, crying patients, irritated doctors. She was used to constant pressure, but some days the fatigue weighed heavier. Today was one of those days. The weight of exhaustion pressed on her shoulders. As she drove home in her worn Honda Civic, the back seat still cluttered with old toys and a week's worth of unwashed scrubs, Emma was waiting in the neighbor's living room, curled up on the sofa with a juice box in one hand and a plastic tiara in the other. She looked radiant, as if glowing from within. Sophie hadn't seen her like that in ages. Her little blue dress sparkled with glitter on the skirt. Her cheeks were still slightly flushed with excitement. Sophie knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead, and gently asked, "Did you have fun, sweetie?" Emma nodded vigorously and launched into a torrent of words that tumbled out like water from an overflowing faucet. "It was amazing. There were lights, music, cookies, and lemonade. And we all twirled and did pirouettes. Mommy, he chose me." Sophie blinked. Who chose you? The man in the gray suit, Emma beamed. Well, he saw me sitting alone, and I told him I didn't have a daddy to dance with, and he said he'd be my daddy just for that dance. Sophie froze for a second. A strange heaviness swelled in her chest. Her first reaction was panic. Who is this man? Why was a stranger dancing with her daughter? Why hadn't anyone called her? Headlines and horrors flashed through her mind, but then she looked at Emma's face again. There was no fear in her daughter's eyes, only wonder. The very wonder Sophie hadn't seen in her for so long, since everything had changed. After thanking her neighbor, Sophie drove Emma home, listening carefully to every detail. Emma recounted it like a fairy tale. The man had brown hair and the kindest blue eyes, she said. He helped me fix my ribbon when it came undone, and showed me how to spin so I wouldn't fall. He didn't talk down to me, and didn't treat me like a little child. He called me Miss Emma, and even gave me a rose from the snack table. That night, Sophie tucked Emma into bed with a heart squeezed between two feelings, relief and anxiety. Relief, because for the first time in months, her daughter felt seen and special. Anxiety, because she didn't know who this man was or what he wanted. Afterward, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence of the house. She hadn't expected to raise a child alone. Emma's father had left 3 years ago, shortly after her 3rd birthday, without warning or explanation. One morning, he kissed Sophie on the cheek, packed his bags, and just never came back. The mortgage, the bills, daycare fees, all of it crashed down on Sophie, and she carried that burden in silence, determined never to show her daughter how hard it all was. The next morning, while Emma was eating cereal, she showed Sophie a picture on the neighbor's phone. The man in the gray suit was kneeling beside her, holding her hand. Both were smiling, as if laughing. That picture hit Sophie to her core. Not just because he was handsome, though he was, but because he seemed to genuinely care. There was a softness in his gaze, something sincere. He wasn't posing for the camera, not smiling falsely. He was just real. Sophie couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at her daughter quite like that. Still, she couldn't fully relax. She asked her neighbor the man's name. Andrew Carter, she replied, as if that should mean something. Sophie's brows furrowed. The name seemed familiar. Later that day, during her lunch break at the hospital, she Googled him. What she found made her sit up. Andrew Carter was the CEO of one of the most influential tech companies on the West Coast. Forbes magazine had called him one of the youngest self-made billionaires. He had given keynote speeches at Silicon Valley conferences and appeared on magazine covers. But his latest photo was different. It was taken at his wife's funeral. The caption read, "Tech giant bids farewell to beloved wife after cancer battle." In the photo, he looked 10 years older, haggard, tormented. Sophie stared at the screen. The man who had knelt beside her daughter was not just a stranger. This was a man the world considered unattainable, almost mythical. And yet, he had seen Emma, sitting alone on the dance school steps, and instead of walking past like everyone else, he stopped. That night, when Emma asked if she could see Daddy Andrew again, Sophie didn't have an answer, but something inside her shifted. For the first time in years, she thought not only about surviving, but about whether she might one day hope for something more. Andrew Carter had never felt more uncertain than standing outside the modest townhouse on 18th Street with a bouquet of simple white daisies in his hands. This was not a place he typically frequented. He was used to penthouses, polished marble lobbies, elegant restaurants with valet parking at the entrance. But here, in this quiet, slightly worn neighborhood, with cracked sidewalks and children's bicycles scattered across front lawns, he felt more out of place than ever. And yet, he stayed. He had called the neighbor from the dance studio, explained who he was, and asked her to pass on Emma's mother's phone number. He wasn't even sure what he hoped for. An awkward thank you, perhaps, or a polite dismissal. Instead, 3 days later, he received a message from an unknown number. It was short and cautious. "Emma wants to thank you in person. Saturday, 3 p.m. He hadn't expected a reply, let alone an invitation. And now, standing here with a heart beating like a teenager's, he felt foolish for caring so much. He knocked twice softly, and a moment later the door opened, and before him stood the girl who had changed everything. Emma smiled as soon as she saw him. "You came," she said, wrapping her arms around his waist before he could even react. She was wearing a soft yellow unicorn t-shirt, her hair down and a little messy, and she looked at him with complete trust. Behind her stood her mother. Sophie Brooks was not what he had expected. She looked tired, but not weak. There was a quiet strength in her face, that of someone who had seen a lot and still kept going. Her hair was gathered in a loose braid, and her tired yet calm eyes met his with cautious curiosity. She wore simple jeans and a sweatshirt, and somehow she remained attractive, not through fashion or self-care. She didn't smile immediately, and Andrew didn't blame her. He was a stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and danced with her daughter. Her caution was understandable. "Hi," he said, extending the flowers. "I brought these for Emma, or for you, or for both of you. Honestly, I wasn't sure." Sophie took them carefully and smiled slightly, reservedly. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to." "I know," he replied, suddenly feeling 12 years old. "But I wanted to." She led him inside. The house was small, cozy, lived in. There were stickers on the refrigerator and small ballet slippers by the door. The shelves held a mix of children's books and nursing textbooks. The furniture was mismatched, but everything was clean and warm. He noticed a framed photo of Emma as a baby next to a pile of unopened mail and utility bills. This was a home built not on money, but on effort. Emma pulled him by the hand into the living room, insisting he sit down and look at her latest drawing. As she chattered about school and her favorite snacks, Andrew listened. For the first time in weeks, he truly listened. Something in her voice, unfiltered and free, calmed something frayed inside him. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She just wanted to share what she loved with someone who would listen. Sophie sat opposite, silent at first, observing. She was polite, but wary. Finally, when Emma ran off to get a sticker album, Sophie said, "I just want to be clear. I'm grateful for what you did for Emma. Truly, you gave her something she'll never forget. But I don't know you, and I always need to protect her." Andrew nodded immediately. "I understand. I'd feel the same way. I didn't come here to complicate things. I didn't plan any of this. That day, I just saw a little girl who reminded me of what I'd lost, and I couldn't walk away." Sophie's expression softened slightly. "Your wife," she said quietly. He looked at her in surprise, then nodded. "Yes, she died 8 months ago. Cancer. We didn't have children. We wanted them, but there wasn't enough time." A silence fell between them. Not awkward, but heavy. Shared loss had a way of leveling people, no matter how different their lives were. Sophie looked down at her hands. Emma's dad left when she was 3. No note, no goodbye. I thought I was ready for it, but when it happened, I haven't really trusted anyone since then. Andrew leaned slightly forward, not to convince her, but just to be closer. "You don't have to trust me," he said. "Not yet, or never, if that's what you decide. I just want to be around. If Emma ever wants to talk, or draw, or spin in a circle until she falls down, she's amazing." Sophie laughed softly, unexpectedly but genuinely. "Yes," she replied, "and exhausting." They talked a little more. Nothing profound. Favorite books, what Emma liked to eat, how Sophie managed night shifts while raising a child alone. Andrew didn't express pity, only curiosity, and Sophie, for some reason, found herself being honest. He didn't make her feel small or guilty. He just made her feel like a person who hadn't been truly seen in a long time. When he finally stood to leave, Emma clutched his hand. "Will you come again?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope. Andrew knelt to meet her gaze. "Only if Mommy says it's okay." Sophie didn't answer immediately, but when Emma looked at her with such an earnest, open face, she quietly nodded. Outside, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft gold, Andrew returned to his car, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, as if the pieces of his broken world were slowly beginning to fit back into something new, something worthy of hope. 3 months of dances passed, and during that time, something unspoken but undeniable grew between Andrew, Sophie, and Emma. What began as an act of kindness had become a regular part of their lives. Sunday afternoons at the park, movie nights with popcorn scattered on the couch. Emma ran to the door when the doorbell rang, hoping it was him. Sophie smiled more often, not the wide, easy smile she'd given in another life, but soft, quiet ones that creased the corners of her mouth when she wasn't looking. Andrew never crossed a line. He never tried to replace anyone. He just showed up, fully present, without expectations. And Emma, who had once carried a quiet sadness, now walked a little taller. But peace in Sophie's life never lasted long. Late one afternoon, as she was leaving the hospital, her phone rang with a number she hadn't seen in years. At first, she thought it was a mistake, then froze. It was him, Derek, Emma's biological father. His voice sounded calm, almost smug, as if not a day had passed. "Hi, Sophie. I was thinking I want to see my daughter." Sophie almost dropped the phone. Her mind flared with a mix of rage and fear. He hadn't called in over 3 years. No birthday cards, no child support, not even a message. Just silence, as if she and Emma had never existed. She gathered her strength to say, "You don't have the right to call her your daughter. You gave that up the day you left." But Derek wasn't fazed. On the contrary, he seemed amused. "I hear you're in good company now, with some CEO type." "Yeah, what's his name? Carter?" "Must be nice. All that money makes me wonder if I shouldn't start remembering my rights too." Then she understood. He didn't want Emma. He wanted power, control, money. Sophie hung up without another word. Her hands were trembling so badly, she had to sit down on the curb outside the hospital. Her first instinct was to protect Emma. Her second was pure dread. Derek always knew how to slip through the cracks, using charm when convenient and manipulation when not. If he truly wanted to fight for custody, or even just visitation, he would find a way to make their lives hell. That night, she called Andrew, not out of panic, not to vent, but because she didn't want to face this alone. 20 minutes later, he was at her door, in a blazer with a loosened tie and a serious look on his face. She told him everything, about Derek's sudden call, his tone, his words, his threats. She expected Andrew to get angry or try to handle it with money or connections, but he did no such thing. He simply sat beside her on the couch and said, "Whatever happens, you're not in this alone. We'll fight this together." Emma slept in the next room, unaware of the storm brewing. Sophie watched her daughter's chest rise and fall with each peaceful breath and knew she wouldn't let this part be stolen from her. But she also knew Derek wouldn't leave quietly. 2 weeks later, she received an official letter in the mail. Derek had filed for joint custody. The text was slippery, manipulative. It claimed he had been denied access, that he was trying to re-establish long-lost ties. Reading it, Sophie scoffed. He didn't even know what Emma liked to eat, let alone what she dreamed about at night. The legal process began quickly. Meetings, documents, court hearings. Andrew gave her his full support, standing by her side, bringing coffee to early hearings, sitting silently with her in waiting rooms when words were useless. The hardest part was telling Emma everything. Sophie carefully chose her words, speaking calmly despite the pounding in her chest. "Sweetheart," she began, kneeling beside her daughter, "we need to talk. Someone from the past wants to see you. Someone who was around when you were very small." Emma frowned, clearly puzzled. "Who?" "Your biological dad," Sophie said softly. "His name is Derek. He's asking the court to let him be a part of your life again." Emma was silent for a long time. Her small face remained unreadable. Then she whispered, "Do I have to?" Sophie pulled her close. "We'll make sure you don't do anything you're not ready for. You're not alone in this." That night, putting her to bed, Emma squeezed her hand and asked, "Will Andrew still be my daddy if this other one comes?" Sophie's throat tightened. She hadn't allowed herself to think about it before, afraid of what she might not be able to promise. But she said the only thing she knew for sure. Andrew loves you, and that won't change, no matter what happens. The following days were filled with legal tension and emotional exhaustion. Derek acted confident in court, playing the role of a reformed man, telling stories of regret and redemption. But he underestimated one thing: Emma. When the judge scheduled a private hearing with the child to hear her opinion, Emma entered the room with the quiet strength she inherited from her mother and the steady support Andrew had helped her find. Later, Sophie and Andrew learned from the court-appointed child psychologist that Emma had said softly but clearly, "My real daddy is the one who danced with me when I was sad. He didn't leave, he came. That's the daddy I want." Sophie wept upon hearing this, not just because of the words, but because they came from the mouth of a little girl who had every reason to feel abandoned by the world, yet somehow found the courage to choose love. The joint custody petition was denied. Derek had no legal rights or standing. The court made it clear that forcing a relationship on a child who didn't want it was not in her best interest. That same evening, as they returned home tired but victorious, Emma rushed straight into Andrew's arms and whispered, "You're still my dance daddy, right?" He didn't hesitate. He lifted her into his arms. "Always," he replied. And for the first time in many years, Sophie allowed herself to believe that perhaps the worst was behind them. The weeks following the court decision were a strange mix of exhaustion and quiet relief. Sophie felt as if she had been holding her breath for years and had finally exhaled. But even now, with the judge's decision made and Derek officially out of their lives, a part of her couldn't stop bracing for the next blow. Trauma teaches you to expect good moments to be only temporary. But still, something undeniably shifted. The shadow that had hung over her family for so long began to recede. Emma started sleeping better. She no longer woke up crying from dreams she didn't understand, no longer asked if someone would try to come and take her away again. Instead, she now woke up quickly every morning, braided her doll's hair, and asked when Andrew would visit again. Their bond only grew stronger. He was the one she ran to with her drawings, the one who pushed her higher on the swings, the one who sat with her when she struggled to read difficult words aloud, cheering every small victory as if it were a championship success. Sophie noticed how Andrew became an indispensable part of their lives. Not loudly, not immediately, but gradually, with his constant presence. He was there for Sunday lunches, helped carry groceries, sat with Sophie late after Emma was asleep. They talked about everything: childhood, loss, dreams they hadn't dared to voice aloud for a long time. They didn't need to prove anything to each other. The masks they wore in their separate, shiny worlds quietly fell away. One late evening, Sophie stood at the kitchen sink, looking out into the backyard where Andrew and Emma were building a crooked, lopsided birdhouse. She watched as he patiently held the wooden pieces together and let Emma hammer in the nails, even though she bent two of them completely crooked. He didn't correct her or sigh in frustration. He simply smiled, adjusted the pieces, and tried again. This image of Andrew, patient and real, covered in wood glue and laughter, awakened something in her chest that she had hidden for many years. Not just affection, not just gratitude, but love. Not the cautious, maybe someday I'll find it again, kind of love she thought she still might find, but something truer, more enduring, deserved. She was still watching when he came in, hands full of brushes and wood shavings. Emma bounced behind him. He smiled. His hair was messy. There was a smear of blue paint on his chin. "We created a masterpiece," he said, possibly breaking a few safety rules in the process. Emma proudly held up the birdhouse like a trophy, glowing with happiness. Sophie laughed, then paused. Her voice was quieter than she expected. "Thank you for all of this for her." Andrew shrugged slightly, as if it were nothing. "No need to thank me." "I am thankful," Sophie said, meeting his gaze. "Because you chose us, even though you didn't have to." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her, truly looked, past the tired eyes and worn sweatshirt, through months of fear and caution, and saw the woman who fought every day to hold her life together. "I chose," he finally said, "and I would choose again." That night after Emma was asleep, Andrew and Sophie sat on the couch. The television was on, showing some show, but neither of them was truly watching. The silence between them had become comfortable, like a pause between heartbeats. Andrew turned slightly and looked at her. "I know things have been difficult, and I'm not asking anything of you right now, but I need you to know something." Sophie turned to him. I love her, he said softly. Emma, not just as a good kid. I love her as my own. And I know she's not mine by blood, but that doesn't matter to me. Never has. Sophie felt her throat tighten, tears burning her eyes before she could stop them. She instinctively reached for his hand, and when their fingers touched, something seemed to take root between them. Something they had both long circled around, but were afraid to name. I know, she whispered. She knows too. The next morning something unexpected arrived. A letter in a plain envelope addressed to Sophie in handwriting she hadn't seen in years. At first, her stomach clenched with tension. Is Derek trying again? Found a new loophole? But when she opened the letter, she froze. The letter came from the state prison in the next county. The handwriting was undoubtedly his, but the tone was different, egoless, raw. Derek had been arrested just weeks after the custody hearing on charges unrelated to Sophie. Financial fraud, assault, parole violations. The letter was an apology, albeit a broken and clumsy one. He admitted that he had abandoned them, chosen himself over family, that he only came back when he hoped to get something in return. You were always better than me, he wrote. And Emma is lucky she got that from you. I thought I'd come back and take what was mine, but now I see I never deserved it. She's not mine. I'm not hers. Please, don't let her grow up hating me. Let her forget me and love the one who loves her now. Attached to the letter was an official notarized statement of full relinquishment of parental rights, short and legally binding. He had signed away any future claims, rights, or presence in Emma's life. No appeals, no challenges, just an end. Sophie sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the letter on her lap, as the sun rose behind her like a quiet promise. When Andrew arrived later that morning, Emma rushed into his arms as always. But this time, Sophie didn't just watch from the sidelines. She walked over to them, quietly placed the letter in Andrew's hands, and rested her head on his shoulder. Looks like we're not borrowing time anymore, she said softly. He looked at her, then at Emma, who was happily humming to herself and talking about pancakes. No, he said. We're building it. Summer arrived slowly that year, stretching over Seattle like a long exhale after a season of holding one's breath. The rain grew softer, the days longer. The light pouring through the windows of Sophie's modest townhouse seemed warmer, more forgiving. After all the legal battles, the fears, the sleepless nights, life finally found something akin to peace. Imperfect. Not without quiet pain, but real, lasting, and most importantly, earned. Emma blossomed. She laughed with her whole body, without fear or defenses, like a child who finally believed the floor wouldn't fall out from under her. Her drawings covered the refrigerator. Her shoes were always muddy from playing in the yard. She started calling Andrew Daddy, even though no one had asked. One day it just slipped out in the middle of a conversation, as naturally as if she'd said it all her life. When it happened, Andrew glanced at Sophie with surprise and emotion, but said nothing in that moment. Later that night, he confessed it was the most important word he'd ever heard directed at him. Sophie gradually learned to let go of survival mode. For years, she had lived in constant tension, ready to run, fight, endure. But now, she allowed herself to linger in bed a little longer on Sundays. She started cooking not just to eat, but for pleasure. She allowed herself to laugh more. And when she looked in the mirror, she no longer just saw a tired mother. She saw the woman she used to be again. A woman who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. And she saw Andrew, standing by her side every step of the way, who never demanded, never pressured, but simply was there, like the sun breaking through the trees. And it was in the middle of this new, quiet happiness that a letter arrived. The envelope had no return address, just Sophie's name neatly written. The paper inside was lined, the handwriting familiar, so much so that her chest tightened before she even read the first word. The letter was from Derek, but not the Derek she remembered. The man who had disappeared without a backward glance, then reappeared only to cause more harm. This was different. The letter was short but heavy, pressing on her ribs as she read. He was in prison now, serving time for multiple crimes, some unrelated to her, others painting a fuller, darker picture of the life he had fallen into. The tone of the letter was stripped of charm. He didn't try to manipulate or provoke. It sounded tired, defeated, sincere, in a way she never thought she'd hear from him. He admitted he had failed them, without explanation or excuse. You're good, he wrote. You tried. I wasn't ready to be a father or a man, and I ran from both. I thought I'd come back and take what no longer belonged to me. But watching what you've built, even from afar, I realize I never was the one who deserved it. The letter continued, describing moments from memory when Emma was a baby, her laughter, how she fell asleep holding his finger. I sometimes think about it and feel like I'm holding on to someone else's life, he wrote, because I let everything go, and now I want to do the only right thing I can. The last page was an official, notarized document of full relinquishment of all remaining parental rights. A final signature without conditions. Derek closed the door he had once burst through and locked it from the other side himself. Sophie sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the letter on her lap, unable to move. It was a strange feeling to get what she had always wanted, from the one she never wanted to see again. There was no joy in the letter, only silence. But in that silence, there was space, and for the first time in years, that space wasn't filled with fear. She waited to show Andrew the letter. That evening, after Emma was asleep, she handed him the envelope without a word. He read it carefully, his brow furrowed, scrutinizing every line. Reaching the end, he looked up at Sophie with a certain surprise. I didn't think he was capable of that, Andrew said. Me neither, Sophie replied. They sat in silence for a while. Then Sophie leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. You know what's strange? I always thought I'd feel victorious if this happened, like I finally won. But no, I just feel relief and a little pity for the man he could have been. Andrew reached across the table and took her hand. That's because you're not embittered, he said. You went through hell, but you didn't let it make you cruel. Later that week, Sophie told Emma about the letter as simply as possible. She didn't read it aloud or talk about prison. She simply said that sometimes people realize too late what's truly important, and that Emma's first daddy had decided to step aside so she could continue to live a life filled with love. Emma was silent for a moment, processing it as only children can, with astonishing clarity. So, now it's just us? She asked. Sophie smiled and tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. It always was just us. Now, it's just more official. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I like our us, she said, especially with pancakes. That evening, they made pancakes for dinner. Blueberry, Emma's favorite. Andrew arrived mid-cooking, still in his work clothes, and Sophie handed him the spatula. No one mentioned the letter again. There was no need. Days turned into weeks. Andrew spent more and more time at their house, quietly settling into the rhythm of their small world. Sophie no longer hesitated when he publicly took her hand. Emma no longer knocked, but burst into his home office, climbing onto his lap during video calls, announcing her presence as if she truly belonged there, because she did. One evening, after Emma was asleep, Sophie and Andrew sat on the porch, sipping tea and watching the stars appear. The air smelled of grass and warm asphalt. Sophie looked at him. Her voice was quiet but steady. I think we're ready, she said. Andrew turned to her, raising an eyebrow. Ready for what? He asked. She smiled. To stop holding back. To stop waiting for something to fall apart. He was silent for a moment, then took her hand, gently lifted her from the chair, and kissed her forehead. I've always been ready, he whispered. And for the first time, Sophie believed it all. In the peace, in the love, in the life they were finally allowed to build, not borrowed, not fragile, but their own, completely, utterly, and without fear. The invitation arrived in a thick cream envelope with a gold border. It lay among the usual stack of mail with supermarket flyers and utility bills. Sophie opened it absently in the kitchen, wiping pancake batter from her hands, expecting to see an invitation to a local church charity dinner or a neighborhood newsletter. But as her eyes scanned the elegant script inside, her breath caught. It was from the Aurora Foundation, one of the region's largest children's charities, inviting Andrew Carter and his guests to their annual gala, a formal dinner, silent auction, a night under chandeliers and soft jazz. She barely smiled, not surprised that Andrew had received an invitation. He served on several charity boards, and his name alone could fund half the evening. Later that evening, when he arrived, she playfully handed him the envelope. Apparently, these socialites still want you. Andrew raised an eyebrow and looked at the invitation. Oh, that. I forgot it was coming up. Usually, I just send a check and skip the social part. Sophie leaned against the counter, arms crossed, with a playful glint in her eyes. So you're saying you've never been to one of these before? Once or twice, he admitted, placing the envelope on the table. But it's not really my thing. Too many handshakes, too many conversations that feel like interviews. Emma, who had been sitting at the table drawing a six-legged dog with a crown, suddenly looked up. Can I go? Sophie laughed softly. It's not really a kid's party, sweetheart. Andrew knelt beside Emma's chair and examined her drawing as if it were a work of art. You know what? He said. Maybe it's not a kid's party, but perhaps this year we'll make an exception. What if you come with me as my guest? Emma's face lit up like a sunrise. Sophie looked over her daughter's head at Andrew. Her eyes were filled with a smile and a hint of suspicion. You're going to take a 6-year-old to a formal gala? He smiled. Only if her mom comes too. And so, a week later, Sophie stood in front of her bedroom mirror in a dark blue dress she never thought she'd wear again. It had hung for years in the deepest corner of her closet, a relic of a younger version of herself who used to go to weddings and dinners when nights weren't spent in scrubs under fluorescent lights. The dress fit surprisingly well, and as she adjusted the straps and smoothed a stray lock of hair, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her from the mirror. Not because she was trying to look like someone else, but because she had finally stopped hiding the woman she used to be. Emma was in a pale gold dress with a tulle skirt that shimmered in the light. Her hair was gathered in a bun with a star-shaped clip. Andrew arrived dressed in an elegant black tuxedo that sat easily and effortlessly on him, holding a tiny bouquet of white flowers for Emma and a single gardenia for Sophie. He didn't say much when he saw them, just smiled quietly, as if storing this moment in some deep corner of his heart. The ballroom was stunning. High ceilings, soft light like stars strung above them, and long tables covered in ivory tablecloths. A string quartet played in the corner, and waiters passed elegant appetizers on silver trays. Sophie felt out of place for exactly 10 seconds until Andrew slipped his hand into hers and leaned in to whisper, "Everyone's looking at you. You're the most beautiful woman in this room." She lovingly rolled her eyes, but her cheeks flushed. At first, they danced slowly together, then took turns twirling Emma around the dance floor. Her laughter was louder than the music. People watched them with fond smiles, not just because of Andrew's status, but because of the obvious, undeniable warmth between them. This wasn't a performance. It was real, and flowed from the way they moved around each other, easily, gently, and without fear. As the evening drew to a close, the charity auction began, and guests returned to their tables. Andrew stood and cleared his throat, asking for the microphone. The hall quieted. Sophie looked up in surprise. He hadn't mentioned a speech. He stood at the front, tall and composed, holding Emma's small hand in his. Most of you know me as a businessman, or perhaps you've read about my company in the news. But tonight, I don't want to talk about innovation or market growth. I want to talk about a moment that changed everything for me. He paused, smiling softly at Emma. Not long ago, I was walking past a dance school and saw a little girl sitting alone on the steps. She said she didn't have a daddy to dance with, and I asked if I could be her daddy, just for that moment. I didn't realize that by agreeing to that dance, I would be saying yes to everything that followed. Family, healing, a love I never thought I could feel again. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, her heart pounding. Andrew continued in a calm voice. Sometimes, those who need us most aren't looking for grand promises or perfect plans. Sometimes they just need us to show up. So this year, I am doubling all donations made tonight. Applause erupted in the room, but Andrew didn't leave the stage immediately. He looked directly at Sophie, his voice softened. And speaking of a brighter future, Sophie, would you come up here for a moment? The spotlight shifted, and silence fell. Sophie held her breath, stood, heart pounding with uncertainty, and walked towards him. Emma took her hand and gently nudged her forward. As she reached him, Andrew turned, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a small velvet box. I didn't plan for this to happen here, he said quietly, so only she could hear. But I realized I don't want to wait anymore. I've waited too many silent years. I want this life with you, with her, forever. He opened the box, revealing a simple but beautiful ring. Nothing flashy, nothing ostentatious, just real. Will you marry me? He asked. Not because we need a title, but because I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life. And I want Emma to never again wonder who her father is. Sophie's hands trembled as she reached for his. The answer came easily, surely, and she couldn't believe she had ever lived without it. Yes, she whispered. The hall erupted in applause. Emma shrieked and hugged them both, and as the music started again and Andrew gently twirled Sophie in a slow dance, they knew that what had begun as an act of compassion had become something unbreakable. Not a rescue, not a fantasy, but a family. Real, unpredictable, full of light, and finally, whole. The years that followed were not without their challenges, but they were full, filled with the kind of fullness that comes from a life truly lived, without evasions or hidden words. Sophie and Andrew married in a quiet ceremony under a maple canopy with a few guests, and Emma stood between them, wearing a wreath of flowers she had painstakingly made herself. There were no headlines, no photographers, no designer dresses. There was only love, raw and true, binding the three of them into something no judge, no DNA test, no court ruling could define. A family created not by blood, but by choice. They bought a house together on the edge of town, far enough from the noise but close enough to feel connected. It wasn't a mansion. Andrew could have afforded 10 of them, but Sophie loved this one, and that made it sacred. The house had a creaky front porch, a yard full of dandelions, and a kitchen with peeling cabinets that Andrew vowed to fix someday, but secretly loved as they were. They painted Emma's new room a soft lavender, filled the shelves with her favorite books, and hung fairy lights on the ceiling that glowed long after bedtime. Andrew still ran his company, but now he came home earlier. He stopped checking emails during dinner. He turned down meetings that took up weekends. For him, success looked different. It was in Emma's voice, which called him Daddy, without hesitation, in Sophie's laughter echoing through the house, in the feeling of holding something fragile and knowing that this time he wouldn't lose it. One cool morning in late October, the family welcomed a new member, baby Oliver, who arrived with a huge cry and a red face demanding attention from his first moments. Sophie held him close, tired but radiant, while Andrew sat beside them, embracing them both, overwhelmed with feelings he hadn't experienced since that day on the dance school steps. Emma, now 8 years old, shyly peeked into the room, approached the bed, and looked at her newborn brother with wide, adoring eyes. "Can I hold him?" she whispered. Andrew helped her settle into a chair and carefully placed Oliver in her arms. She looked at him with such tenderness that Sophie had to squeeze her eyes shut against tears. "He's a bit wrinkly," Emma said after a long pause, smiling, "but I like him." Life found its rhythm again. Unhurried mornings with cereal and cartoons, school trips and weekend hikes, nighttime feedings and diaper disasters, and endless cups of reheated coffee. It was a beautiful chaos, the kind Sophie had once been afraid to even dream of. She still worked part-time at the hospital, but now it was her choice, not a fight for survival. Andrew's company continued to thrive, but he no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. The most important things couldn't be measured by press releases or annual reports. And then came the spring recital. Emma had been rehearsing for months. She was now one of the older girls, leading her group through a dance she had helped choreograph herself. Sophie and Andrew sat in the front row of the auditorium. Baby Oliver slept in a sling on Sophie's chest. The lights in the hall dimmed, and music began to fill the space. And there was Emma, taller now, her bun perfectly neat. The blue dress shimmered slightly as she walked confidently onto the stage. She was a picture of grace in motion, all long limbs and focused expression. And for a moment, time stood still. Sophie felt her chest swell with pride, remembering that first dance, that broken little girl in the blue dress, sitting alone on the steps, and the man in the gray suit who decided not to walk by. When the recital ended, the hall gave a standing ovation, roaring with applause. Andrew quietly wiped his eyes, stood, and clapped the loudest of all. After the performance, as the crowd began to disperse into the foyer, Emma ran up to them. Her cheeks were pink, her arms outstretched. "You were magnificent," Andrew said, pulling her into a hug. "Did you see me do the triple turn?" she asked excitedly. "I saw everything," Sophie replied. "You shone." But then, Emma did something no one expected. She pulled a small folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket and handed it to Andrew. "This is for you. I drew it at school." He slowly unfolded it. It was a drawing, made with crayons and markers on thick paper. 3 stick figures stood under a banner that read, "My family." One tall figure in a gray suit, a woman in scrubs, a little girl with a ribbon in her hair, and a baby with a pacifier. They were all holding hands. At the bottom, in big letters, it read, "Thank you for choosing us." Andrew knelt beside her, pressing the drawing to his heart. "You chose me too," he said softly. This moment hung in the air like a still photograph, pure and warm, and would stay with them forever. In the years that followed, the story of how their family began was told many times. At school performances, at bedtime, and even once during a podcast that Andrew reluctantly agreed to participate in. But no matter how often it was told, its essence remained unchanged. A man once walked past a dance school, a girl once sat alone on the steps, and one sentence, simple yet powerful, rewrote their entire lives. "I'll be your daddy for the dance." It all started with that, and it became everything. The powerful ending of this story is not just that it's happy, but that it's earned. This is not a fairy tale where a rich man appears and fixes everything. It is a story of healing through presence, not perfection. It is a story of a man who lost everything and didn't try to run from his grief into distractions, but allowed it to lead him to something real. It is a story of a woman who carried the burden of survival for many years, never asking for rescue, but still reopening her heart, not out of need, but by choice. And it is the story of a little girl whose quiet sadness was transformed, not by grand gestures, but by someone who simply chose to stay. The ending reminds us that family is not always what we're born into. Sometimes, it's what we build, slowly, awkwardly, bravely, together with those who show up when it matters most. That's what makes this story beautiful. Not that everything ends perfectly, but that everything turns out to be real, and real always lasts longer.